Thank you, John, for reading for us from Exodus chapter 3 and the first 15 verses, where we find Moses working as a shepherd. Such a long way from the palace in Egypt of his upbringing. Such a long way from the reasons for his escape as a fugitive from Egypt. Such a long way from home. But the story isn't over with Moses as a shepherd in the wilderness. In fact, the story is only just beginning. Because in chapter 3, Moses encounters God at Mount Horeb. This is the mountain that we also know as Mt Sinai, possibly because of the word bush, which sounds in Hebrew like the word Sinai. Maybe this incident is where it gets its name from. But certainly what is remarkable about this moment is that Moses in the wilderness sees this bush burning. Not just burning, but burning in such a way that it keeps on burning and it is not consumed. I can't begin to imagine how many books and essays have been written as to how that happens. Well, I have to say, theologically, that's about as interesting as what sort of whale it was that swallowed Jonah. Adventures in missing the point. The point is not the bush. The point is that Moses encounters God. Moses encounters God in barefoot holiness, turning his eyes away from the all too visible presence of God. And from this bush, from this encounter, God speaks. And God says that God has seen, God has heard, God has known, and God has come down. God has seen what is happening to the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. God has heard their cries of anguish. God knows what they are encountering and experiencing, and God has chosen to do something about it. God has come down. As Christians in September, we're almost thinking of Christmas, or at least we're at that stage where we're moaning to one another about the fact that mince pies are available already. But the whole story of Christmas is of God come down, incarnation, God with us as one of us, in the midst of us, God come down. Here in the book of Exodus, we have a pre-telling of that story. God comes down to rescue God's people. God has seen, God has heard, God has known, and God has come down. And what will that look like? Well, it will look like Moses, the shepherd in the wilderness, looking after his father-in-law's sheep. It will look like Moses sent to do the will of God. So come, Moses, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. God has seen, God has heard, God has known, God has come down, and God's answer is Moses. And Moses is not impressed. But the next two chapters are full of Moses coming up with questions and excuses and arguments as to why really God should find an alternative. Moses has questions, lots of questions, and they culminate in chapter 4, verse 13, with his heartfelt, "Oh my Lord, Please send someone else. Read on for yourselves, enjoy. But for this morning, it's just the first two questions that Moses asks that will delay us and excite us, I hope. For Moses asks, "Who am I?" And Moses asks, "Who are you?" And God's answer to Moses' first question is very simple. When Moses asks, "Who am I?" God simply says, "I will be with you." Who am I? Absolutely nobody. Well, actually, Moses had a few human advantages. There was all the stuff about understanding the palace and how it worked, having lived and being raised in the palace, and he knew what was going on. And so as well as his disadvantages, there was some good stuff there. But at the end of the day, when Moses says, "Who am I?" he's thinking about the fact that he is a runaway, a fugitive from justice, a nobody as far as the Israelites are concerned, and an enemy of the state as far as the Egyptians are concerned. Who am I? And God says, "I will be with you." Who is Moses? Moses is the one who God is with. Who is Moses? He's the one who has God on his side. And suddenly we're into all those other amazing Old Testament stories of the most unlikely characters who are strong because God is with them. Who is David, a quivering little boy in front of the giant Goliath? Who is David? David is the one, not simply who understands the disciplines of physics and projectile weaponry. David is the one who has God with him. Who is Moses? Nobody without God. Absolutely the right person with God. But Moses hasn't finished with his questions. Who are you? What is your name? When I say to them that God has sent me, they're going to ask, "Really? What God is this? Who sent you?" "What is your name?" says Moses. They're bound to ask. And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." If you ever read in your Old Testaments and notice that sometimes the word Lord is spelt in capital letters, that's because that is representing this name of God that is represented in English with 4 letters, YHWH. We sometimes use the word Yahweh. Some Jewish people will refuse, out of respect, to even name the name of God. And that's why in the Old Testament it's often transliterated as simply Lord. This name is a holy name. This name of God. You shall say, "I am has sent you." This is God's response. Which God? What God? Yahweh. The God. The God and Father of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This God. This is one of those famous passages that is hard to fathom. It is a slightly enigmatic response that God gives. I remember hearing years ago someone trying to translate it as, "God will be everything that you need God to be." And I like that as a fulsome translation. But I went to my big books on the shelf to see what some of the other writers might say. And Walter Brueggemann, who is always good value, an American Presbyterian preacher and theologian, writes this in his commentary on Exodus. "It is enough to see that the formula bespeaks power fidelity, and presence. This God is named as the power to create, the one who causes to be. This God is the one who will be present in faithful ways to make possible what is not otherwise possible. And this God is the very power of newness that will make available new life for Israel outside the deathliness of Egypt. Which God? What God? Yahweh. I am who I am. Moses asks, who am I? Nothing without God, everything with God. And who are you? Everything that you need me to be. And so eventually, despite his protests, Moses will go. And eventually, he will lead the people to the promised land. God calls us to go for God. God calls us to be makers of disciples. God calls us to be God's salt and light in this world. Because God knows what this world is like. God has seen, God has heard, God has known, and God has come down. And God knows what it feels like to be a slightly fragile church in these difficult years. And God has seen, and God has heard, and God has known, and God has come down. God calls us to go. The celebration of the incarnation that is Christmas is a celebration that needs to be a celebration within the church throughout the Christian year. For it is the incarnation, God coming down, that gives us our ability to respond to God's sending out. As Jesus said, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. In the same way that the Father sent me down, so God is sending you out, down into this world. And when God sends, know who you are. You are the one whom God is with. And know who it is who sends you. The one whose name is I am. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. God is, and God sends us. Early in our reading, Moses responds by taking his shoes off in the presence of the holiness of God and saying, "Here I am." May we have the grace and courage to do the same. Amen. Let's take a few moments to be quiet.